We'll start. Welcome to all. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining this webinar from. Here in Brussels, it's 4:02 p.m. Mathilde Gaston-Maté, I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach for DAI's European Business Unit. And I'm really glad to welcome you for the discussion on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the climate agenda for development. So for those of you who did not attend previous sessions, this webinar is part of a series that is organized jointly by DAI and the European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECDPM, and now also with the support of Euractiv as our media partner. Quick introduction on the two partners. So DAI is a global development company with over 50 years of experience working with a wide range of clients from donors to governments or private companies. And ECDPM is a global think and do tank working on sustainable development policies and practices. Our series brings together public and private practitioners to reflect on the impact and opportunities of the pandemic on global development, with a strong focus on the European agenda for international partnerships. Each of the webinars explores a particular topic for a 75-minute lively discussion. Before the summer, we looked into sustainable and resilient agriculture value chains, digital financial inclusion, and economic recovery in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Today's session on climate will be followed by two more webinars, one on gender lens investing in about 2 weeks, and one on development finance late November, which will close DAI and ECDPM's collaboration for 2021. The webinars are recorded, and all past and upcoming sessions are and will remain available on our websites. Coming back to today's session, it's entitled Green Deal Approaches to COVID-19 Recovery. It will be facilitated by Hannah Knappen from ECDPM, whom I'm really glad to introduce to you and who will take over from now on. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoyed this webinar.
Thank you, Mathilde, and thank you to everyone, panelists and people in the audience for being here today. Let me introduce to you the topic of today's webinar. So we have seen that the initial crisis response policies all over the world aimed at mitigating the most immediate and pressing challenges that were caused by COVID-19 and the subsequent economic fallout. And let me tell you, this fallout has been large so far, and it will continue to be huge. Globally, in the next 2 years, global economy will lose approximately $8.5 trillion in economic outputs. In Europe, we see that all countries are undergoing severe output losses as a consequence of the COVID-19 crisis, and the African continent is facing its first recession in 25 years with output losses amounting to some $99 billion. This crisis has set the continent back years. Now, governments in Europe, as well as in Africa, as well as international organizations are developing policy and investment packages that aim for long-term recovery from the crisis. Many packages in Europe, for instance, stimulate a green recovery in line with the EU Green Deal. Now, in this session, we'll bring together 4 fantastic panelists who will discuss key approaches to support this global green recovery. And the topic will not be more timely. We have the upcoming G20 summit, end of October, and importantly also COP26 in the first 2 weeks of November. And at COP26, countries must agree on a finance architecture, including an agreement on the continuation of long-term climate finance, and of course, how to recover from a global crisis will be at the center of these discussions. Now, let me first introduce to you all our 4 panelists. We have Andrea Alfieri, who is Head of Sector Climate Change at the Directorate-General for International Partnerships, DG INPTA, at the European Commission. We have Donald Lunan, Director of the Climate Unit at DAI. There is next Nancy Saich, Chief Climate Change Expert at the European Investment Bank and also member of the Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance of the EU. And last but not least, Jean-Paul Adam, Director of the Technology, Climate Change and Natural Resources Division at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you all for being here. So let me just explain to everyone a bit the structure of today's webinar. I will first ask each panelist for a short intervention. I have a key question for each one of you. And after that, we will open the floor for Q&A. The idea is that everyone types a question in the chat and I will then read it. Unless you absolutely want to speak out, you can also specify this in the comment in the chat. And I was also asked to ask you all to mute yourself as panelists when you're not speaking. And except for the panelists, you can turn off your camera. So also the idea is to have an open discussion, as informal and as critical as possible. And yeah, so let's start. I will start with you, Andrea. So there are very strong calls for economic recovery packages to stimulate a green recovery in line with the EU Green Deal. That's really a milestone policy, also with an important external dimension. And it's now crunch time. We are looking at implementation also of the new multi-annual financial framework. So tell me how to implement the external dimension of the EU's green transition combined with its Build Back Better policy objectives, and especially for African countries.
Well, thank you, Anne. Thank you for your question, and good afternoon or good morning, good evening to all the participants that are connected today. Thank you for the opportunity to be with us and for organizing this. Look, no, maybe I will start by bringing in a little bit of the perspective of, let's say, what we do at the Commission in terms of international cooperation along the lines that you just highlighted. So focusing maybe on some elements of the so-called external dimension of the Green Deal, which it's what we are currently busy programming for the next 7 years, as far as my Directorate-General is concerned in terms of international cooperation. But you spoke about this Build Back Better, this green recovery, which I think it's important to stress that, as you said, there are big losses ahead of us if we do not intervene, but there are also big societal and economic gains that I think have been estimated in a number of studies supporting, let's say, this transition. So there are benefits to be harvested from countries all over the world at different income and development level. And I think there are, let's say, economic benefits that have been estimated around 2.something% at the level of global GDP, of course, varying across regions, but also in terms of jobs creation. I think there are no doubts that this green transition will deliver. Now, I think we need to make a distinction here between, let's say, the role of more developed countries, big emitters, vis-a-vis other countries that are facing, let's say, the effects of this climate change. So it's fair to say that from, let's say, more developed country, there is need to enhance and implement, let's say, strong commitments, particularly in terms of climate finance, as you were mentioning. I have to say that from the EU side, personally, as a EU citizen, I'm quite happy of, let's say, what this Commission has produced so far in terms of engagement in relation to reduction of emissions, which you know, has been embedded in the climate law, in the Fit for 55 package. So in that sense, I think we are showing a good level of leadership from our side. At the same time, I mean, I have to remind that the EU member states with the EIB at the moment are the largest provider of development assistance worldwide, and also in terms of climate finance, we are providing a large part of this 100 billion pledge that will be a key topic for discussion in Glasgow. And I can say that as far as the international cooperation is concerned, we aim to increase our commitment in the next 7 years. You know that the target has been set at higher level in the new Global Europe instrument. And the President, von der Leyen, has recently restated in her speech at the State of the Union that, you know, this 30% will be increased further with some commitment. Additional commitment, which she quantified in 4 billion. let's say overall our strategy at the global level remains anchored, you know, in the multilateral system, in a rule-based system. We believe that we need these rules in order for all countries to participate to the effort in a fair and transparent way. And for us, the Paris Agreement, the SDG agenda, and the Sendai framework, let's say, remain the three cornerstones of our action, both on climate mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. So in fact, you will see that in the next 7 years, we will try to, let's say, orient our cooperation strategies at all level, country, regional, or global, around the tools that, you know, these agreements have put in place, including NDCs, NAPs, and long-term strategy. We are well aware that the ambition at all levels needs to be increased. We all know, we saw the studies that NDCs have to be enhanced in a number of elements in order to comply with the Paris goals. But we believe that these are the key elements, not just for us as, you know, in terms of international cooperation, but for any country in the world. We have plans. We need to embed these plans in national development strategies, and we need to find a way to, let's say, link these plans to concrete investments. Speaking about adaptation and resilience, which you mentioned in your question, I have to say from our side, we intend to keep the balance in terms of development assistance between adaptation and mitigation, which is what we managed to do in the previous years. Particularly for Africa, I think there are few elements, few areas of work where we intend to, let's say, invest and focus in the coming years. One is definitely the sustainable agri-food sector, for many reasons, including the links to economic growth for many countries in Africa, but also for nutrition and food security elements. Water is another, I think, area where we will have substantial investments in the continent, because we all seen the reports from IPCC and the need to strengthen water conservation and reinforce water distribution systems vis-a-vis natural disasters. So water will be, I think, an important element to core in the continent. And the last one would be infrastructure, in the sense that, of course, we need to make sure that new infrastructures are climate proof, but there is a lot to do in terms of making sure that the existing infrastructure are adapted to the new reality. These three areas of work for us are priority, and I think together with early warning systems and strategies at national, regional level, on which we have invested quite a lot in the past years, this will remain key areas of work for us. One emerging area that I think it's important to stress here is the one related to disaster risk financing, including sovereign and non-sovereign insurances, which we believe are a very interesting and important area of work in the coming years. From one side, because we need to make sure that governments have in place the right macroeconomic policies to guarantee good balance, good equilibrium vis-a-vis the losses that you can be expected from more frequent disasters. On the other side, I think there is a portion of the risk that cannot be really, let's say, met through additional investments, but there I think the insurance has a lot of value. And cross-cutting issues that I would like to mention on this is the local dimension, because we believe that locally led adaptation strategies are an element that could bring a lot of value to whatever we do in this area. Can be at community level, can be at city level. There are initiatives ongoing and on which we are investing. And we believe that these are bringing in real value added, because it brings in a dimension which allows our strategies to be fit to the context and to make sure that they are owned by the communities and the population that we assist. Last point that I will mention, and I close, otherwise I keep speaking too much, is of course, I mean, from our side, we can mobilize a certain level of development assistance, and you saw the amounts that we have in the and the new global Europe instruments, around 80 billion for the next 7 years. But of course, the key issue here is how we can leverage private finance. And I think in that sense, the question that we need to ask ourselves is what kind of incentives we can put in place. We can have, as for instance, you can find in the Green Deal for the EU, certain policies that generate, for instance, trigger some reactions into the economic stakeholders. So carbon pricing, like for instance the trade emission scheme of the Union is one of them. So you bring in some price signals into the economy and allow the stakeholders to respond. But there is also a regulatory environment that I think can contribute into this effort of leveraging further private finance. Regulatory environment, I mean, for instance, items like the taxonomy, the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance, which allows to identify, for instance, activities that can be further financed by public and private actors that are green, that do comply with climate goals, but also mechanisms that reduce risk for private and public investors. And I think here about the guarantees mechanisms that you find in the European Fund for Sustainable Development. Of course, there are plenty of other dedicated products, like for instance green bonds, on which I think that you can find in the Sustainable Finance Action Plan of the Union, that can be an example to be used also outside the Union and internationally. I close here and I give you back the floor, and over.
Okay, thank you, Andrea, for this very comprehensive overview of the Commission's climate ambitions. I will not summarize what you said. I think it was very clear. But what I heard, what struck me was that there will be a strong focus on adaptation, and this actually brings me to the next speaker. I would like to turn to Nancy now. So Nancy, you wrote an article for our ECDPM September issue of Great Insights, in which you explained that climate banks, such as the EIB, can spur a green transition. And we know that also the EIB, that has the ambition to become a climate bank, will also focus much more strongly on adaptation compared to its past portfolio that was strongly geared towards mitigation projects. Now, in your article, you mentioned that difficulties exist which limit the EIB from investing in adaptation. Could you perhaps elaborate on that? Thank you.
Yes, I just want to check you can hear me well.
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Fine. Thank you very much for inviting the European Investment Bank to join this webinar. Indeed, I think as a climate bank, it's very important that we think about adaptation as well as mitigation. Not to suggest that we take our foot off the pedal on the efforts on decarbonisation and supporting our clients in that important transition, but understanding that we actually have to do both at the same time. And on that note, actually, I'm very happy to tell you that as part of our Climate Bank roadmap, we committed to develop an adaptation plan. So if you like, a strategy within the strategy. And in fact, our adaptation team have been hard at work on that. And it is a global strategy. So it's an approach for adaptation, both inside and outside the EU. And it was approved by our board yesterday. So I'm sure it probably has to be tidied up and proofread again before it's put on our website, but it was approved yesterday. So this is very exciting. It actually sets an adaptation finance target within our green finance target. And I think that's very important because, you know, banks are in many ways, not entirely, but in many ways measured by finance. And our colleague from DG INPTA was just talking about the delivery of climate finance. And indeed, the 100 billion is an incredibly important topic for the COP. But there's also, of course, the discussion about how much adaptation finance there is, particularly for some of the poorest countries whose emissions are still incredibly low in comparison with the older economies, as it were. And of course, those countries are often the least able to deal with the impacts because of lack of infrastructure and lack of finance, but also perhaps other issues of having very spread out population, perhaps having particular vulnerabilities of very low-lying areas, or already dealing perhaps with drought and floods, which are just being exacerbated by climate change. So on the one hand, yeah, very positive. We're stepping forward with this strategy, with our adaptation plan, with our new target, with the idea that we must also have more technical assistance. We need to help drive that whole adaptation agenda. But it isn't easy, and it isn't easy for a number of reasons. One is because adaptation is always case and location specific. And that's true in the developing world, it's true in Europe. So it's really important to actually have good information on climate change impacts. And of course, that's not always available in some developing countries, although there's a lot of climate information now available in comparison, say, to 5 years ago. But the difficulty is also about how to integrate this building of climate resilience into other development plans. And I think probably the most important thing that we need to do now when we talk about Build Back Better and the green recovery is to make sure that we don't miss this opportunity as we're helping developing countries strengthen their healthcare, their vaccination programs, their hospitals and their infrastructure, that we don't miss this opportunity to try and make sure not just that they're built to be resilient, but that we actually think about how those communities and cities and countries can be more resilient to all types of shocks and impacts, so that, you know, we don't just treat the pandemic and climate change completely separately. Ultimately, they are different, obviously, but they're also about shocks and impacts and challenges to public sector, private sector. They also have the same inherent inequalities in that, you know, there's always more impact on women and girls. There's always more impact on the poor. There's always more impact on the elderly and the sick. And if we don't set about addressing those inherent inequalities, if we're not aware of them, if we don't think how to tackle them as we respond to the pandemic and as we think about dealing with climate change impacts, then, you know, we're already on a back foot. So I think there's a lot we can learn from the pandemic, and I would say that it is a challenge, but trying to put this back to, you know, in a way where we start to think coherently about multiple risks that are being faced in developing countries, and how we can, you know, not address them one at a time, but help systems be more resilient to multiple shocks, is probably a very important way to go. The previous speaker talked about insurance. There are obviously different financial solutions, but I think that sometimes people tend to think too much about infrastructure. And although, of course, it is important to have some infrastructure, it is important to think about things like flood defences and increased water storage and so on. But also, especially when you have countries which have limited borrowing capacity, it's important to think about, well, what are the low-hanging fruits for adaptation? Sometimes they're not so easy, in fact, for a bank to finance. You know, a bank is always looking for a bankable project. But actually, some of the lowest hanging fruits are improved warning systems, you know, improved escape routes, improved centres for evacuation, you know, in areas which are going to be safer and where the community can move themselves and perhaps their livestock to in the occasion of an extreme event. So I would say that there's multiple things we need to do. They're all case and location specific. They all involve interlinkages between different plans, different sectors and different players. But at the end of the day, actually, we need to do a lot more of this because the climate change impacts will keep multiplying.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy. We are very happy to hear that the adaptation plan has been approved well ahead of COP26 too, so that's very good. Now, you're already giving some examples of financial solutions. That brings me to the next question for Donald. So from your perspective of DAI, so you're undertaking projects to achieve long-term green recovery in many countries globally, understood. So what can be innovative financial schemes to support countries and specifically to support a climate resilient recovery?
Thanks, Hannah. And I think, well, I mean, I think maybe if I could start by taking a step back. I think, you know, I'd like to chime with much of what Nancy said in terms of, I feel like we needed an Overton window, a window of opportunity where the political stars aligned. And I feel that the delay in COP26 has provided us with that window. In the 12 months that have preceded leading up to November this year, there's been a huge change in momentum in terms of how we talk about climate. There's been political change, which we all know about. But I think it also, the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the interconnectedness of our lives and the need for global action. Nancy talked much more eloquently than I about the impacts and how that has been laid bare. But I think, you know, the other aspect has been that the culmination of climate disasters through 2020 and 2021 has also helped to focus minds and the need for urgent action. And I think we now have the opportunity in which to take action, and we need to seize it. And Andrea talked about the Green Deal being something as a EU citizen that he's proud of. As an ex-EU citizen, I'm also very, very fond of it. I think it provides an excellent overarching framework and a template for others to follow. Yeah, I mean, we're in a position where we can start to build the low carbon future that we want to build. And there's an element, there's part of me that is worried about, you know, complacency setting in. We become numb to the climate disasters, or we see backward steps in policy and leadership. And I think the other element underpins much of what we do at DAI is making sure that the transition is just and fair in all the countries that we work in. And so ensuring that we're not pulling up the ladder or leaving people behind it underpins everything that we do. And then you asked about innovative financial models. I mean, the work that we do at DAI touches upon so many different areas. You know, we work on policy, we work on both the development and delivery of policy, on the governance and institutional strengthening. We work in trade and market systems. We work in finance, from the insurance and the social protection elements that were being talked about previously, through to, you know, government bonds and green portfolios of banks in the countries that we work in, and touching on a whole range of different topics. And so it's weaving that together, you know, the systems approach and recognizing that there is no silver bullet, and that we need to continue to collaborate and innovate across all of these different aspects. So and in response to your question, there's two elements I would look at. The first is we have started to set within DAI quite ambitious targets around our own corporate, if you like, approaches to climate and net zero. And part of that process has allowed us to look at the programs that we have and review them, if you like. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as saying audit, that sounds a little bit formal and fiscal, but looking at our programs and seeing, you know, what could we be doing better? What are the impacts of the project, but also activities on those projects, and where could we be more ambitious? Where have we missed risks or opportunities on the projects that we want to address? And so that's part of the work that we've been doing, and it's been you know, I think accelerated by COVID and you know, the need to take action. But the other piece is that, you know, through that, but also through the dialogue that we have with our clients and our stakeholders, we're looking at new ways of delivering. So, you know, from at the top level, working on developing green bonds, on the taxonomy around those, how governments can blend the public and private finance to deliver on ambitious programs of work. But also looking at where, you know, insurance policies can ensure that climate finance is reaching the most vulnerable, the groups of people that are most impacted and least able to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. And so there's you know, from the very top to the bottom billion, if you like, we're working to strengthen our approaches and how we can make the whole system more resilient.
Okay, thank you, Donald. Well, I hear that as DAI, you are underlining the importance of this transition to be inclusive. Also, you're taking a systemic approach, and then you gave a few examples of green bonds and insurance policies, blending, and so on. Maybe during the discussion, we can dig deeper into these examples that you gave. Now, I would like to turn to our last speaker, Jean-Paul, who can talk to us about what green recovery means in Africa. Earlier this year, your organization, UNECA, published this impressive report titled Building Forward for an African Green Recovery. And it speaks in a very convincing way about how green investments can improve the quality of recovery in terms of, on the one hand, job creation and employment, and on the other hand, how it can build resilience to climate change in countries, which is very interesting that it can tackle both these issues. And the report also gives concrete examples of South Africa and Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, can you explain us how concretely, from the perspective of your work, these green investments can make a difference?
Thank you very much, Hannah. And it's great to be in this panel with so many distinguished speakers. And I think we have a lot of ideas, I think, that will complement each other. Firstly, in terms of the rationale for the UN Economic Commission for Africa to undertake this report, it's based on a recognition that the growth models that have been pursued in Africa up until recently are perhaps not adapted to the current environment where we're facing a pandemic, because they are not resilient enough. So essentially, if we refer back to the Millennium Development Goals, African countries made very rapid progress, essentially on very high levels of economic growth, often approaching 10% per annum in some countries. But they were very much driven by essentially providing commodities for global markets, quite often on the basis of extraction and exportation with minimal value addition. And immediately that the pandemic hit, growth levels plummeted, because quite often the markets where they were exporting these products had less demand for them. And also the supply chains were not very well integrated within African economies themselves. So there has been limited resilience built in terms of long-term employment. And hence the highest amounts of losses in terms of jobs have also been in Africa, where employment has been much more precarious. Climate change threatens to disrupt the particularly jobs even more radically in Africa. And conservative estimates that we've done that are featured in this report show that African countries will lose on average around up to 5% of GDP by 2030. That's less than 10 years from now. And that's using conservative warming estimates. If we go into high warming estimates, then the losses accelerate. And there's also geographic differences. So regions such as the Sahel may lose up to 15% of GDP just to climate change. So no matter what growth levels that might be achieved through export-driven growth, climate change will wipe it out almost immediately, within 10 years. So the necessity is also to look at a new model of growth for African countries, which is more resilient. And the study has looked at what would the form of the sort of priority investments that would be made that would have the most impact. And the studies that we have done, the ones that are already published are based on South Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, intentionally two slightly different countries, one which is more industrialized and one which is a low-income country with limited industrialization. We have subsequently done two other countries, which are Egypt and Kenya, and there are 6 more in the pipeline that will be published soon. So the studies show very clearly that there are some base investments which are common, and first and foremost is investment in energy, and renewable energy now offers the most convincing return on investment in terms of the cost to generation ratio, and the report does show that it also will generate, if there is investment throughout the supply chain, it will actually deliver a larger multiplier in terms of the jobs created, as well as the multiplier effects throughout the economy. So in a country such as South Africa, we saw that the return on investment on investing in green energy and associated knock-on effects would actually bring a return of 420% higher than if investing in fossil fuel-based investments. It would also bring a return in terms of jobs of 250% higher than if investing in fossil fuel-based investments. So these are very dramatic differences. So energy is the platform that then creates multipliers in other sectors of the economy. And the second area which really emerged as a priority is around resilient agriculture and food production. And this is particularly re-looking at the modalities of agriculture on the African continent, which are often challenged by inefficiencies. It often involves very small scale landowners trying to use limited inputs to essentially deliver subsistence level agriculture. And then you may have, where there is some level of industrialization, it's hampered by poor trading links, including infrastructure such as road links, but also the perennial problems of access to energy and therefore the reliability of access to those sources, as well as the challenge of appropriate access to affordable financing to upscale investments where opportunities do lie. So the investing in climate resilient agriculture, which essentially means looking at the energy sources, the water sources that are available at the place where agriculture is taking place, the links that those have with local communities, and also looking at the technological inputs that are available, upscaling them where possible, using digital technologies around, for example, the use of climate information services, and also the access to appropriate and environmentally sensitive fertilizers and other related inputs. And moving towards those kind of investments can radically transform transform food production in the continent. And using more standardization, particularly around environmental standards through the African Continental Free Trade Area, also represents an opportunity to upscale investments in those sectors. And the third area of common opportunity that we saw was around what are called nature-based solutions. And this would mean investing in the rehabilitation of the natural environment, but linked directly to livelihoods. In countries such as South Africa, this is linked to ecotourism, the development of parks, but also the development of ecotourism around coastal areas, for example. In countries such as DRC, this was translated more as agroforestry and the planting, for example, of fruit trees around water sources for the protection of those water sources, but also providing rehabilitation of the natural environment, but also creating employment opportunities subsequently. And these types of nature-based solutions often are relatively low cost to implement. They also can be rolled out very, very, very quickly. They also bring immediate returns in terms of the protection of the natural environment, recognizing that although Africa actually has probably one of the most important areas of forest cover that still exists on the planet, the rate of loss is also the highest, with over 10,000 hectares lost over the last, 3.9 million hectares lost over the last decade. And that's the highest rate of deforestation among all regions of the world. So we face in a sense, an opportunity because Africa has still very large biodiverse natural environment, but we have to address the rate of loss and do so in a way which creates employment. So I will just wrap up on a few of the financing initiatives which can be associated with investing in these three sectors. So first of all, recognizing the vulnerability of African countries, there has to be upscale in the delivery of grant financing and very concessional loan financing, which is available to Africa. And unfortunately, the recent OECD reports have shown that the rate of increase is marginal. There is a slight increase, but it's very low, and vulnerable countries are actually struggling to get access to these resources. There is also a need, and this is where we think there are real opportunities to mobilize the private sector in these countries, both by mobilizing the private sector of those countries themselves and creating vehicles for investment from other regions such as Europe. And I concur with all the other speakers that, for example, green and blue bonds will be a huge opportunity. There are a number of African countries that are going down this route, but currently Africa represents less than 1% of global green bond issuances. Now we're trying to change this. The ECA has been supporting an SDG 7 initiative, which is investment in energy, renewable energy. And a few days ago, South Africa actually issued a 3 billion rand green bond, which is mobilizing financing for the restructuring of its energy sector. It's essentially restructuring existing financing deals, but the liquidity created will be invested in green generation, and that's one of the conditionalities of this issuance. We need to reduce the cost for Africa to be able to access these bonds, and that involves blending. It also means de-risking those finances, and one opportunity that the Economic Commission for Africa has flagged is the creation of a repurchasing or repo market for Africa, which would create more demand for African bonds. We're also supporting African countries that want to develop debt for climate adaptation swaps. Now, these involve essentially repurchasing or restructuring existing debt and then refinancing it more affordably, either by extending the tenure or by getting a partial debt write-off or some grant financing, which therefore reduces the overall cost of that debt, and the liquidity that is subsequently created being invested in climate adaptation. I have some experience of having done this when I was working in the Seychelles government in 2015, and we are now working to support some countries that are interested in doing something similar, including Cabo Verde and Senegal. And there's also interest from countries such as Mauritania that are interested in looking at protecting their marine zones more comprehensively. And the final point, which has also been mentioned, which I think has a lot of merit, is a global carbon price, which again allows countries in Africa to actually leverage their natural heritage in a way that they can mobilize resources to invest precisely in climate resilience. And we've, in the study that we've done, the Green Recovery for Africa, we've shown that just in 3 sectors, which are renewable energy, agroforestry and climate smart agriculture, and investing in clean cooking, with an increased global carbon price of up to $50 per ton, Africa could mobilize up to $30 billion per annum to be reinvested in climate resilience. So we believe that this is one of the most critical aspects to be achieved at COP26. Thank you very much, and back to you for further discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jean-Paul. Thanks also for sharing these ideas and for sharing also for emphasizing the need for a new model of growth and the need for investments in renewable energy, food systems, nature-based solutions, as you said, despite the daunting negative climate impacts in Africa. So now I would like to open the floor for questions. I see that people have already started typing questions. I go a bit back up in the chat. There is a question from VOCA, so a DC-based NGO working on rural agricultural development. So my plan is to read out the question. If you want to add something, you can open the mic and speak up. I see Brian Cohen. So the question is about the Green Deal and whether it has any geographic focus internationally. So that's the first question. I think it's directed to Andrea. And secondly, whether it's possible to link this EU Green Deal with US efforts on green economic recovery. So I think this question is directed, could be responded by Andrea, if that's fine.
If I understand correctly, what's the relationship between our policy and the US one?
Yes, and if there is also, yeah, maybe what's the difference, and if there is also a possibility to link, to cooperate together on green economic recovery.
I think, I mean, it's a very broad question, and of course, I mean, the strategies, you know, are changed depending on the administration in place, of course. What I can say is that if you look at the recent meetings that we had at the level of the G7 and the G20, and also, you know, the pre-COP in preparation of this COP26, I think the US administration, the new administration, has come forward strongly in support of this, let's say, global green agenda. Also in terms of commitments vis-a-vis climate finance. So in that sense, I think there is a positive trend, I would say, from the US side in contributing more let's say, to adaptation and mitigation goals in developing countries, in our partner countries. I think, for instance, what we were saying now on energy, on renewables, and let's say sustainable energy in general, which puts together renewables but also energy efficiency measures. I think that's an area where you see a lot of convergence between what we do and what our US colleagues do, particularly in Africa. There are plenty of initiatives that we are co-funding. And of course, I mean, the return on the investment, which we just heard, is something which is extremely attractive, and it's a sort of magnet for all of us, because we see a big opportunity, particularly in a continent like Africa, where there is large untapped potential for renewables. So in that sense, I think you can find a lot of elements of convergence, and energies, sustainable energy is one of them, for instance, in Africa. And I'm quite positive, I think, for the future, to see more engagement from the US side along the lines that we have highlighted, for instance, in the Green Deal. Over to you, Anne.
Okay, thanks a lot. I see another question. It's about carbon pricing. It's also directed to Andrea, but I think maybe to give you a break, I think Jean-Paul also mentioned carbon pricing. So perhaps you could elaborate on that, Jean-Paul. So the question is, what do you think about the call for a global price on carbon? And and what about the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the Green Deal?
Thank you. I think this is actually a very important question, and I think we need to look at carbon price both in terms of what's the intended goal of a global carbon price, and then secondly, what it means for developing countries. And so firstly, the intended goal of a carbon price is to incentivize ambition. So currently there is not a global carbon price, and generally where there are carbon trading mechanisms or carbon offset mechanisms, it's at a very low price. And this has meant that the impact of carbon offsets globally has been minimal. And in some cases, there's arguments as well that it's not actually necessarily reducing, or at least not to a large extent, existing emissions, it's more preventing future emissions. And there are fears that it also creates a license to pollute, essentially. So the goal of a global carbon price, it must be aligned with the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is warming of no more than 1.5 degrees. And if we follow the guidance of the IMF that recently, a few years ago, published a paper on this, they estimated that at that time, to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement would mean a global carbon price of between $75 and $80 per ton. And I think there was two ranges. There was a first initially about $50 per ton, and the later $75 to $80 per ton. But in any case, much higher than is currently. The challenge for developing countries is that it is much harder for them currently to invest, for example, in renewables, even though there is a great desire to do so. There are over 22,000 megawatts of energy proposals in African NDCs. So there's a lot of ambition in Africa, but the challenge is starting from a very low base. And things like solar and wind require backup energy because of the issue of intermittency, which in Africa still has to be invested in. And although renewables offer some of the solutions for that backup energy, in the case of, for example, in East Africa, there are opportunities for geothermal energy. There are also risks where recently you saw in, for example, Southern Africa, where a lot of hydropower dams actually were operating at below 50% capacity precisely because of climate change and the lack of and droughts. So we have to recognize that Africa does need a transition. And so a global carbon price is I think a very good way to incentivize it, and those countries that have the opportunity to do so, to leverage their carbon assets, their carbon sequestration assets. You've got the peatlands of the Congo, for example, which just those peatlands, which are the second largest carbon sink in the world after the Amazon, just those peatlands, they actually sequester 3 years worth of global emissions. And if African countries were able to leverage this to actually mobilize more money, it would be a huge opportunity. The issue of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is that if it is simply used overnight as a means of, let's say, providing an incentive for industries within the European Union and essentially giving them a competitive advantage versus emerging industries in Africa, it will not, in my opinion, have served a good purpose. In the context of a global carbon price, where you can channel investments precisely into the areas that are needed in Africa, which would include around investing in renewable energy and investing, for example, in nature-based solutions, and then with the opportunity to further use those nature-based solutions to generate resources through carbon offsets. I think that's a huge opportunity which should be encouraged, but we have to recognize the essentially the divergence that is already there in terms of level of development, and any adjustment mechanisms at the border have to recognize this. Thank you.
Thank you for your very clear and elaborate response. So there is another question from Pamela for Nancy. So the EIB recently got a go on having the development bank branch. Now, in addition to being an EU climate bank, so how will the EU bank use this new position, so this change in position, to boost its external climate action, specifically with regards to, I think this is LDCs, so least developed countries and small island states?
So yes, it's thank you. It's a very important new development for the EIB. I mean, we are already a global multilateral development bank, so we do operate all around the world in developing countries wherever the EU gives us that development mandate, and we will obviously continue to do that. But the stepping up to having the development branch is really to organize ourselves and organize our cooperation with others in a much more proactive way, focusing on that development part of what we do. And to have people in local offices and people with expertise, not just in development, but also the climate and development, gender and climate, also biodiversity and human rights, to have those kind of experts particularly focused on the development side, and also to build, I think, stronger partnerships with, obviously, with DG INPTA and other parts of the EU system, the EEAS, but also with other financiers, including EBRD, and I think it's about being more strategic and more structured. Not to say that we haven't been strategic and structured. We've been doing this for many years, but one can always do it better. One can always focus more. I think in a way it's similar to the climate challenge, the adaptation challenge that I was asked in the first question, and it was touched on also by the DAI speaker, in that we will need not only to restructure ourselves, but we'll also need to think quite clearly about what kind of resources are needed in terms of people and expertise, but then also different financial resources, technical assistance, subsidies, and so on. And in order to make sure that we have the impact, I think that's the biggest accelerator in a way, is we've had this results measurement system for quite a few years for our development finance, but I think this real focus on impacts and on impacts against and delivery on the SDGs is probably where we will need to do more effort, and that will, I think, lead us to be more focused on how we can help LDCs and SIDS, because they are countries where it is harder to find bankable projects, and where it is even more important, therefore, to work with the countries on their long-term plans, work in partnership with other entities, and try and find how to put together the right financial solutions for delivering impact in those countries. So I think it's a very, very exciting and new step forward for us. It will build on what we've been doing before, but hopefully the impact will be greater. And I think it will be wonderful when we can say we are the Climate and Development Bank.
Yes, thank you. Perhaps I can build on this question, because you mentioned that you want to work with countries on their long-term plans. And I hear a lot of ideas also by the other panelists on green bonds and blending mechanisms and so on. So perhaps here, I'd be curious to hear whether the EIB will now in the next step also help developing countries in issuing their own green bonds or blending mechanisms. This as a way, perhaps an effective way to help empower local institutions in these developing countries.
So we're doing some of that already, in that we're working in the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, which is looking at how to help build the global capital markets, globally, in order to sort of learn from what everybody's doing and not reinvent the wheel in all different parts of the world. And also to ensure that what we're doing is compatible in terms of definitions and systems and frameworks, so that indeed these kind of instruments can be part of the bigger green global finance market. But indeed, we have done some work already with some individual, particularly regional development banks, supporting them in green bond issuance. We also have a technical assistance program already in place for supporting medium-sized corporates in developing countries, because we see that there's a lot of green bond issuance by really big companies, but particularly in developing countries, there's not so much use of that instrument of the next size down. It is also a thing that we're doing as part of our work with cities, because obviously there's great opportunities for cities to issue green bonds, including cities in developing countries. But there's much more that can be done, for sure. There is, whether it's working at country, sovereign green bonds, or whether it's working with banks and as I said, corporates, also cities and regions. So I think that's something that we can see we would want to do more of. I think that it's also another place where you need partnership. So for example, we try and work a lot together with others that are helping on the discussion on, how can you use the EU taxonomy in the global context, and how can it help build confidence in the green financial market. And I'm very encouraged by the work that's going on, and I think I'm hoping it will be announced at the COP or shortly afterwards, on finding the common ground in these different green taxonomies around the world. And what you find is that there's a lot of similarities. I mean, of course, there may be some differences in certain things, but there's a lot of similarities. So I do think that's a place where we need to continue working. And I wouldn't say it's the only thing. I mean, there are other things that need to be done in the green financial system. We can also try and support innovative green funds, which are looking specifically at investing in developing countries. And one that the bank is investing in also with the EIB Luxembourg Climate Finance platform is the CRAFT Fund, which is a fund looking at adaptation, technical solutions and services which are needed in developing countries to help bridge the gap between climate data and actual solutions on the ground, whether it's in agriculture or food production or other sectors. So I think there's, I would say yes, green bonds, but there's also other things where we can help develop and support other green financial instruments. But the last thing I would say, actually, by the way, is just that everything doesn't have to be green. There's many things that we do and will continue to do in developing countries, which are for social objectives or for delivering on other SDGs. And those are terribly important. I do get rather upset when people start to think or even talk about everything that's not green being somehow brown, grey, or in some way harmful. That's not true. And many things that are not green, that are not harmful at all, and they're actually for other very good reasons. You can think of vaccination centres or hospitals or schools. But what is really important is that they're all resilient, climate resilient. They also need to be compatible with the temperature goal, and also they mustn't undermine other environmental and social goals. So I would just like to get that on the table, because I do feel both in the EU and outside, we're sometimes muddling up and feeling that everything has to be green. No, everything needs to be greening everything needs to be improving, but not everything has to be green. Lots of very important things that aren't green.
Yes, you're right. Thanks for emphasizing that. Now, I would like to encourage people to type their questions in the chat. I see people are sharing ideas, links to studies, also email addresses, which is a nice new way of networking in these calls. But yeah, if you have questions, we have another 15 minutes or so for the discussion. Also, if you prefer to speak up and directly ask your question, that's also fine. Now, and also, if the panelists would like to react to anything that has been said by the others, please go ahead, of course.
Well, I was going to respond to both Nancy and Jean-Paul, because I mentioned green bonds as well, and I agree it's an important tool in the armory, but currently, the work that we've been doing in green bonds has been in economies like Egypt and Nigeria and others that are quite mature and attractive to investors as well, with a settled private sector. And the thing that concerns me about some of this is also the sort of the negative feedback loops that we see in Africa. The impacts of climate in the most vulnerable countries makes them less investable and less attractive to investors. And in fact, it further closes the fiscal space, if you like, around investment, both from the government side and from the private sector. And I'd be interested just to explore that a little bit with you both, and just hear your thoughts on. You started to talk about it, Nancy, about other mechanisms, but it would just be interesting. I mean, from my point of view, I think particularly in the lesser developed countries, there needs to be greater emphasis on the partnership and the local ownership, and building up those ecosystems, if you like, that allows a more robust intervention. That I sometimes think it's a little bit fly in, fly out sometimes. Anyway, that I just wanted to throw that in the mix.
Can I add something on that? I mean, actually, one of the things that we're very interested in at the bank is the gender and climate nexus, especially in developing countries, because I mean, I think everybody's well aware that in climate change catastrophes, whether it's or other catastrophes for that matter, like earthquakes and so on, it's known that women and girls are more likely to be killed or to die in the weeks that follow for lots of reasons. They're less able to travel, they might be looking after children and elderly people, they're more likely to be in their homes maybe, but that's one side of what has to be thought about. But recently we've been working a lot in this what's called the 2X challenge, which is a sort of gender empowerment and about supporting women entrepreneurs. And what I found very interesting in the meetings that I was in most recently is that there's quite a lot of evidence in developing countries that by supporting women entrepreneurs in low carbon sectors, so for example in renewable energy, small scale off-grid renewable energy or other low carbon sectors, you actually have a bigger climate impact. In other words, actually there seems to be more uptake of sort of low carbon solutions and renewable energy solutions through women entrepreneurs. And don't ask me what that is, but that is apparently the case. And so that's a very positive thing, and that kind of especially when you're talking about off-grid solutions or local technical solutions, that is something that can be done even in the poorest regions, and can have obviously a double effect. And I wonder whether you would see the same thing also if you were to look at nature-based solutions and biodiversity and gender. You might, I don't know, I didn't go to that meeting, so maybe somebody in the panel knows that. But there's some things like that which can be done basically and supported in any country, in any part of the country, because it really talks about empowering a part of the community who will then have a knock-on effect on building the resilience and also rolling out technologies which make that community actually more able to have energy and at the same time not increase emissions. So I think to my mind there's quite a lot of that kind of thing that we should be doing. And certainly when we think about very remote regions or parts of Africa that do not have any energy supply, and I huge proportion of population in sub-Saharan Africa doesn't have any electricity supply, let alone low carbon. We need to realize that's going to take a very long time to build the big electricity networks. You know, I mean, we're still completing our 10E networks in Europe. And so therefore we do need lots of different scales, including, you know, off-grid solutions, maybe, you know, village solutions, maybe city block solutions. And in one way, and there's many difficult challenges about climate change and the poorest parts of the world. But one thing is that they have some opportunities to leapfrog what we did, leapfrog the old high emitting solutions for power and transport. And we need to grab those opportunities while making sure we're still focused on delivering the SDGs.
I can just follow through very quickly. I think we need to also understand the scale of the financing gap globally. We estimated that to achieve the SDGs, the gap has grown to almost $93 billion for Africa alone. And so, you know, there's a lot of focus on the 100 billion, for example, to be mobilized from COP26. But we must understand the 100 billion is only a small part of what is needed. It's sort of the starting point, and to which we must then add other resources. And I think that's where we need to look at Africa and look at the different elements. So green bonds, as was pointed out, I think, you know, it's, as Donald pointed out, tends to be more valid for countries that already have a certain amount of market access. And we can work with those countries. And I think what we would like to see is, in particular, that green bonds are rewarded, real ones that have real impact. And these can be measured through key performance indicators, but they should be made much cheaper. I mean, Egypt, for example, is still issuing green bonds at over 5%. They did one in October 2020 at over 5%, which is significantly cheaper than a number of other African countries, but it's still 5 to 6 times more than what you would have an equivalent green bond for renewable energy in Europe, for example. And there's a way that we can deploy resources by blending it that would really reward countries that already have market access, let them get that access for cheaper if it is going towards climate resilience. And we should recognize that there are countries that are even lower middle income or middle income in Africa that are currently active on the bond markets. An example would be Ghana. And this is very interesting because a country like Ghana accesses also what's called the PRG Growth and Resilience Trust, which is very concessional finance. So they're borrowing at very cheap rates from the PRGT, which is operated by the World Bank, but they're also borrowing from the market at high rates because they've got so many needs that are immediate. And again, countries like Ghana could be supported for those areas that are economical, where you can get a return, for example, renewable energy, but reduce their cost of access through blending and through other forms of support, through de-risking. And that will also liberate funds that are currently being taken from the PRGT. It will make all resources go a bit further. And I think we have to look at it in the context of the large scale of resources that need to be mobilized. And a lot of them can be done from the private sector, which would then also further liberates funds from the public sector and grant funding, which can be invested in areas that are harder to fund through market-based mechanisms.
Yes, great. Perhaps, Andrea, do you want to react to anything that has been said?
No, I think the last point that Jean-Paul made, I think is an important one, and we go back to de-risking, and we go back to leveraging private finance. And I think the example that he made in relation to green bonds, I think is a very interesting one. In general, I think, I mean, Nancy, I mean, I'm very glad to say that the EIB is coming up strong also on adaptation, and I fully share the point that she made on making sure that any action that we fund or an investment that we make, responds to these 3 core principles that she mentioned. It's not just the word green that we need to look at, but it's multidimensional. It's do no harm. It's contributing to multiple targets at the same time. I think one point which I think is I was thinking of during the intervention of the other colleagues, when we were mentioning different returns on investments or on activities, and which I think is something that probably would need to be reinforced on a global scale, is the understanding of, you know, a natural capital accounting, in terms of, you know, how much natural resources contribute to wealth of countries, and how much the deterioration of this natural resources endowment costs and will cost for many countries. I think it's an important point that would really help, you know, in making sure that these resources are exploited in a more sustainable way, including for carbon sinks. Jean-Paul was mentioning some peatlands, and you know, the way they store carbon is impressive. But I'm thinking also about other ecosystems, like coastal ecosystems, for instance, like wetlands, seagrasses, etc. That, you know, have been suffering for quite a while. They play a lot of important roles in terms of both climate adaptation and mitigation, for instance, in the coastal areas. So I think natural capital accounting should be reinforced in general, because it could shed light on well, the economic and value of many natural resources that the continent is very rich of. Over to you, Anne.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps a last question then from my side, because I'm also looking at the time. We have a few more minutes. We haven't talked much about climate diplomacy and partnerships. So looking, for instance, at potential for a Europe-Africa partnership on green transition and climate action. This is, in my opinion, I don't see a really strongly or well-functioning platform to discuss these issues, but perhaps I'm wrong. So that would be my question to you, perhaps Jean-Paul or Andrea, how you see this. Also in early next year, there will be the Europe-Africa or the EU-AU summit. We know already that climate and green transition will be high on the agenda there. But what is the potential, or what is the platform, let's say, for to discuss these issues in an effective way? Perhaps Jean-Paul, do you want to go first to share this from an African perspective, if you can say that?
Jean-Paul had to leave.
Okay. I missed that. Yes, now I see it in the chat. Sorry. So yeah, Andrea, can you perhaps share very briefly your view on this?
Look, I mean, you mentioned the summit that you know, should take place early 2022. Definitely, I mean, these issues are on the table at the, you know, highest political level. I think we need to understand that you know, the relationships between Europe and Africa, you know, do not, you know, revolve around only this dimension, although it's very important. So you always need to discuss these type of issues in the context of broader discussions of political relationships, economic relationships between the two blocks. So I would not single them out, let's say, in one specific platform, but I think even in the preparation of the summit, this dimension is emerging very strong across all the different working groups that have been already active, you know, on a permanent basis. I can only say that indeed it will be a key topic for the forthcoming summit, but let's say more. I would say embedded in broader discussions also on topics like trade, economic relationship, security, migration, etc. This is something that I think will emerge clearly during the summit and in the next months. Over to you.
Okay. Yes, we at ECDPM will be following this closely. So I'm looking at the time. I want to thank you all for taking part in this discussion. It has been very stimulating, very fascinating. I learned a lot of new things. Perhaps the key takeaways is what I hear is that there is much more focus on adaptation from the Commission, also from the EIB, which is very welcome. Then what I learned also is that the pandemic has shown this global interconnectedness and also a need for a more systemic approach. and also that the green transition should be inclusive, should be just and fair. And this whole thinking around new ways of finance has also partly been accelerated by the crisis that we found ourselves in. And it has pushed, as I said, organizations to think more systematically and to make sure that investments, whether they are green or not, that they contribute to many other causes. So also health, employment, resilience, and so on. Yeah, I think we all got a lot of ideas on innovative tools for financing, and you were also very frank in discussing the pros and the cons, which was very good. And also what was interesting is the concrete examples that we got on areas of investments, such as nature-based solutions or food systems in Africa that actually can give high returns on investments. And I would like to end with the point that Nancy made, that improving gender equality is also a way of achieving green transition and transformation. I think that's very important, and I would like to end this very interesting webinar with this point. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
panel.